Improving Alpha Innovation in Investing, ESG and Technology with Michael Oliver Weinberg, in partnership with Vidrio Financial, is being sponsored by Alternatives Watch, providing a 360-degree view of investor mandate activity across alternative investments, and PEVC Tech, a community for family offices, private equity funds, lenders, and VCs using AI and analytics to generate alpha. Vidrio Financial is a premier data management provider shouldering the responsibility for your data from collection to extraction, transformation, and enrichment. Vidrio monitors over 2,000 diverse funds, processing millions of data points each month. Discover how Vidrio empowers your institutional portfolio data by combining advanced AI and human expertise to yield comprehensive analytics on performance, cash flow, risk, valuation, and more. All delivered seamlessly through Vidrio's Data Management Hub. Save your investment team valuable operational time, providing actionable insights like never before. Explore more at vidrio.com.
Hi. This is Michael Oliver Weinberg. We'd like to welcome everyone to the Improving Alpha, Innovation in Investing, ESG, and Technology podcast series. Today, Robert Wolcott, Adjunct Professor at the University of Chicago, will be our guest. So listeners have a high-level sense of our roadmap for today. We'll start with some background, then discuss innovation in technology as it pertains to investing. Investors and business leaders should be able to extract a great deal of value from Robert's insights. On that note, welcome, Rob.
Thanks for having me, Michael.
My pleasure. So let's start with your book, Proximity. To me, it's funny. It reminds me a bit of the Beider-Meinhof phenomenon in that after you introduced me, I see you're laughing, and after you introduced me to it, I realized how omnipresent the concept either is or is becoming. But for listeners, why don't you delineate at a high level what it is?
Great. Thanks, Michael. Great to be here. So proximity is a concept that is predictive of where every industry is going the rest of our careers. And I know that sounds hyperbolic, but it's not. And that's what you've been experiencing. So the concept explains a lot of what's going on in technology. So it started back in 2014. I was at a tech conference, and I don't know about you, Michael, but after a while, all the speakers start to sound the same, especially when they're talking about the future. And I thought we've got to be able to do better in terms of generating foresight, because ultimately investing is about having some reliable foresight, not predicting the future in detail, but seeing the contours of it. And so I posed the question, which is, what is fundamentally different about digital, all things digital, compared to the industrial age? And when you look at that, you realize that digital technologies of all sorts allow us to compress capabilities into smaller and smaller packages and distribute them all over the economy, ever closer to each moment in time and space. You can't do that with most industrial age technologies. And so therefore, they allow us to do things we could never have done before. And here's the key point. Digital compels value creation ever closer to the moment of actual demand in time and space. That's proximity. And that's the direction of every industry the rest of our careers. Moving production and provision of value ever closer to the moment of actual demand.
And so, I mean, is that another way of saying faster, smaller, cheaper, like semis and digital equipment?
Something like that, but I want to be clear. We're not just saying, let's respond faster to customers. Look, everybody's been saying that for centuries. We all want to do that. The fact is we can do things that were never before possible, and they're far more effective, far more responsive, and so therefore more competitive. And those that figure out how to use all of these technologies, and whether we're talking about artificial intelligence or 3D printing or rooftop solar power generation or any of these technologies that allow us to build technology platforms and business models to procrastinate. We're actually saying, build your systems to wait as long as possible before creating a product, service, or experience, before providing that product, service, or experience, because then you can become far more customized to the need in the moment. And I can give lots of examples, but Michael, the easiest one, the one that everybody knows right now because it's so shocking and visceral, occurred when ChatGPT 3 launched at the end of 2022. So before ChatGPT launched, if you needed a marginal speech for an event, you agonized in front of a blank screen for hours. You wrote your marginal speech, and then you went off to your event. Now, after ChatGPT, you go to this thing. It's a blank screen, and there's nothing happening. Now, we know there are servers in Iceland somewhere. Okay, that's nice. But for you as the user, there's a blank screen. You throw a prompt in, and seconds later, out comes a marginal speech for your event. Now, of course, it's your job to make sure it's the speech you want, but nonetheless, the system was set up to wait until there was a specific need, and then it produced and provided that output in the moment. That's proximity.
I guess there are a lot of ways we can take this conversation. This would seem to have massive implications on companies, the existing industries. Does it, I imagine it makes obsolete some companies and or industries, and obviously is very disruptive. I'm curious to hear your thoughts in that respect.
Sure. Well, that's absolutely true, but it's a much more complicated picture than that, because, for instance, there will be incumbents. There already are incumbents that are figuring out how to use these technologies to stay in the game, and in some cases even lead. Whereas at the same time, there are rising companies that are doing it far beyond everybody else. They've really taken the proximity concept as far, and they're leading the proximity concept. So I'll give you an example. The question for an incumbent is, to what extent do we need to build brand new, and to what extent can we leverage our legacy? Let's use a simple example. When Disney decided to get into video streaming, which, by the way, is 100% proximate in the provision of video content. Why is that? Well, because today you can watch any video you want, anytime, anywhere. That's proximity. Now, that, by the way, Michael, we're not saying that this is all great. You can binge watch the Kardashians now anytime you want. So what could possibly go wrong? But the fact is that any video content, the provision of it is proximate already. So when Disney said we need to get into video streaming, they probably should have gotten in earlier, but anyway, they clearly needed to build a new platform. Whether that's with partners or not is another issue, but they needed a new video streaming platform that he didn't have access to before. However, they have the greatest library of entertainment content in the world, so they're able to leverage that legacy to have an extraordinary advantage as they enter this war for viewers for the future. So the critical question for an incumbent is, what can we leverage of our legacy? What do we have to build brand new? And the challenge that a lot of incumbents have is they look at the new technologies. Not that they don't see these technologies, of course they do, but they have a tendency to ask, what can we use this technology for to be a little better at what we already do? And that's a good thing, but that's not nearly enough, because somebody else is going to come out and do something we could never have done before. And that's where proximity is taking us.
So it's the disruptor, so it's the Clayton Christensen or the canonical disruptors that are the real threat, or where, in other words, it's doing something different and or new rather than just marginal improvements.
Yeah, although you don't have to be a brand new startup. In fact, there are a lot of extraordinary examples coming from established companies, rising companies. So I'll give you one of my favorite examples, and this is a publicly traded company. By the way, full disclosure, I'm an investor. I'm a huge fan, but you do what your listeners should do what they want. I'm not making investment recommendations.
Neither are we.
One of my favorite companies to follow, and I've been doing it for a while, is Axon. AXON. They pioneered the taser many years ago. And then later on, they pioneered body cams for police and security officials. They were collecting data from all of these body cams. They were using analytics on these data. And then out comes generative AI. And they quickly adapted that generative AI to pull the data from the police body cams and instantly populate police reports. And now think about this. I'm sure that police officers love filling out police reports,
yeah, right.
But to the extent they don't, now they have an option where they push a button and the police report is automatically populated. Now they have to go back and edit it and make sure that it's accurate. But think of how much that allows the officer to spend the time doing what he or she got into the field to do, as opposed to filling out a TPS report. And then let's even go another step further. This year, for the last few years, they've been partnering with drone companies to bring whatever security officials needed wherever, whenever, at a moment's notice. And this year, Axon announced they were acquiring 2 drone companies, an interior drone company and an exterior drone company. So what are they doing? They're looking at all these emerging technologies and finding those technologies that bring what security officials and citizens require where and when they need it, faster, better, closer to the moment of demand than anybody else. And it doesn't matter what the technology is, could be AI, could be drones. They're saying, what are the needs of my customers and citizens? And let's bring these technologies to them in the best way possible. And it turns out they're driving proximity. If you look at their share price, they're up something like 120% in the past year, and $30 billion market cap. This company just keeps knocking it out of the park.
So that's one example. So then, in terms of if I think of like companies that have centralized production of something, goods or services, will that all be, laser printed near or printed near the end user at some point? Are centralized manufacturing facilities yesterday?
Well, kind of. So it's a little more nuanced picture than that, but the direction that is new is toward proximity. So think about it like this. Today, we have a global supply chain optimized for scale manufacturing at a distance. Yes. The larger my plant, the lower my cost for the most part. Now, that occurred, by the way, in a context of Pax Americana, and before that, Pax Britannia, where you had fairly stable global shipping, you had fairly stable geopolitical situation. That would allow you to optimize that long-distance supply chain. But that optimized long-distance lockstep supply chain is also very brittle. And so what have we seen the past decade or so with climate change and extreme climate events, with pandemics, with geopolitical challenges, problems in the Red Sea, et cetera? So this has caused a situation where people are saying, hey, we really need to consider reshoring, nearshoring, onshoring. So that's a set of dynamics that is catalyzing proximity. But that's not what enables us to really do this in a competitive way. That's digital technologies. So like you mentioned, 3D printing, for instance, plant automation, robotics, et cetera. These technologies allow us to create mid-sized plants distributed closer to demand, networks of plants. In fact, Sam Altman's trying to do that with chip production for AI. It will allow us to start to have production of certain products in urban areas near where people live. Not everything, but in certain cases, things will become economically viable and then competitive. And then you'll start to see production of certain products in urban areas. And ultimately, not yet, it's not ready yet, but ultimately on your counter at home. Think about how difficult it is to buy one matching fork. The way we do it today is they're produced in China and they're put in boxes and sent to a store months later, and I buy 12 matching forks. With 3D printing, it's trivial already to push a button and print one fork to order. And by the way, Michael, if you want to have a picture of your kids on your fork, you just upload a photo and push a button and you've got that highly customized fork, something we could never have done before in an economic basis. So what you're seeing is incumbents like Ford Motor, for instance, reporting that they've produced hundreds of thousands of parts for automotive using 3D printing for specific purposes. They're not printing entire cars at this point, certainly, but they're looking across their supply chain and saying, where are the risks? Where do we have outstock issues? How do we improve our efficiency in our manufacturing facilities by leveraging 3D printing for specific applications? And what happens? Just like every disruptive technology, most implementations fail, but some succeed. And then people start to find value added, real business value. They get better and better, more and more flexible, more and more capable, and they rise up and change the game. So where we're heading in manufacturing globally is to a hybrid model with large plants at a distance for certain things, medium size distributed closer to demand, and even small implementations for one-offs and very highly customized inputs.
Like if you think about goods, manufactured goods, right? Like it's easy to say, well, you just print a fork, right? And sure, if you're indifferent to what material the fork's made of and workmanship, you can print a commodity fork, right? But like we live in a world where everything is so engineered. And is it not the case that, like, sure, it's easy to print, it's easy to laser print color on a paper, or it's easy to print a fork made of one metal, but like if all of a sudden you start needing copper and brass and zinc and aluminum, and there's a level of complexity, like is it sort of an oversimplification to say, isn't this more narrowly applicable to simple things? Does that make sense?
Well, we can talk about things beyond 3D printing, but just to stay on this note for a moment, that's been the case for decades. Decades ago, you could just make little polymer baubles. People use 3D printing in development labs, for instance, product design labs.
Right.
But today it's far more capable. In fact, in the book, we talk about Allocation Technologies, which is arguably the leader in alloy metals in the world of advanced alloys. And about 15 years ago, leadership said, you know what? 3D printing in metals is not ready for prime time and won't be for a while, but we need to get into the game. We need to figure this stuff out, and we need to be ahead. And so if you want to see the future of 3D printing in metals, look at Allocation. But I'll push back a little bit. I mean, those forks you buy at Crate and Barrel, they're all the same material. I buy 24 forks. They're all the same material. But with 3D printing, we're increasingly in a situation where you can actually have multiple capabilities, multiple materials. Think about it like a cartridge system. But there's something that's going on right now that's very interesting in the 3D printing space. And again, proximity is much broader than 3D printing. That's just one little pocket of activity. But what happens in disruptive technologies in general is when they get to the point where the public is aware of them and media starts to talk about them, there's, as we all know, the hype cycle, right? And everybody says, oh my gosh, look, 3D printing, isn't that cool? And everybody's kid starts to play one at a maker space, and it becomes big. And then what happens? It sort of collapses again. It overpromises and underdelivers, and people say, oh, see, I told you, that's not going to work. But then what happens? A lot of the companies fail, or they fall by the wayside. But behind the scenes, some people, like I mentioned, Ford Motor, for instance, they figure out value-added applications for it, and they get better and better, and they learn. And sometimes, usually, there's somebody there with a lot of capital, with a great balance sheet, that's going around and sweeping up high-quality technology assets and customers. And there's a company right now, and again, I have no idea if this is going to work out in the long run, but they're incredibly well positioned. It's called Nano Dimension. If you look, they're acquiring Direct Metal, they're acquiring Marked Forged just this year, and after those acquisitions, they'll have nearly their current market cap in cash on the balance sheet. So they're very well capitalized, and they're mopping up all these great assets to attempt to be a leader in the additive manufacturing future. But, Michael, proximity is relevant in every industry. In the book, we talk about how we work, how we eat, how we create and produce, how we prevent and cure, how we power, and how we defend. And in the conclusion, we talk about virtual reality and space, because those are the two horizons of the 21st century. Humanity's never been there before, but we will be there this century. And those are both 100% proximate. So all the development going on to take us to space and to build VR capabilities is driving toward proximity.
Let's talk about infrastructure and power briefly. You and I have discussed that. That seems to be a good example where, the benefits of decentralized, and I guess from a sort of Nassim Taleb perspective, anti-fragility. And
yes,
you want to touch on that?
Yeah, sure. So this is another example where our infrastructure will become hybridized. In fact, it's already becoming hybridized. But I published an article in Forbes not earlier this year about the case of Bangladesh. We talk about it in the book, and as opposed to the case of Bhutan. And Bangladesh, about 14 years ago, they've always had horrible problems with providing electricity to their population. So about 14 years ago, the government said by the year 2023, we will have enough power generation in Bangladesh to serve the whole country and our growth. And guess what, Michael? They did it ahead of schedule. 2022, they had built enough power generation facilities to serve the country. But here's the problem. It didn't work. Why didn't it work? Well, because they built a bunch of big centralized power generation facilities that all run on hydrocarbons. Now, the sustainability discussion is another very important discussion, but set that aside. They don't have developed hydrocarbons in Bangladesh. So they're at the mercy of geopolitics. They're at the mercy of energy prices. So they announced that they had achieved this great feat in 2022. And then Vladimir Putin rolled his tanks into Ukraine and natural gas prices shot through the roof. So they failed to solve the problem. But here's the punchline. Over the past decade or so, people in Bangladesh, not because of the government, but just because of need, they started to install solar arrays with battery backup. And these were communities not connected to the grid, light industrial facilities that couldn't rely on the grid, homeowners, et cetera. So they started throwing these solar panels up all over the place. And guess what? The communities, the businesses, the families that have access to these are far more resilient. They're not as concerned about what's going on in the power grid. And so what if, Michael, back 13, 14 years ago, the government had said, our objective is to have electricity available wherever, whenever people need it, as opposed to have enough electricity generation in the country? They might have solved the problem. And what they would have done was create a hybrid solution. They would have built some of these large-scale production facilities, the traditional ones, but they would have encouraged a whole lot more of these decentralized, they're called distributed energy resources, DERs. And so when you combine DERs with the baseload energy production capabilities, that's the hybrid future we're all trending to. This would have helped enormously in Texas back during their crisis a few years ago during the winter storms. And they've started to make more and more moves in that direction. So in any case, we talk a lot about this, Michael, in the chapter, How We Power.
Yeah. So one thought that catalyzes to me is it reminds me of in the U.S. now, right? Increasingly the FANG or the Mag 7 building their own nuclear plants or sourcing their own power. Data centers, Amazon sourcing its own power, and on it goes. Microsoft, Alphabet, Google. Does it become, though, the haves and the have-nots, and those who can do that have sort of 100% power all the time, and those who are reliant on the government system are increasingly less, or maybe not the government, because technically utilities are somewhat deregulated. But I guess my concept is more, is that a trend in humanity towards sort of going away from centralized governments and organizations, and is that a net positive for society or a negative? I don't know. Maybe that's too big a question.
You've asked a big, complicated question, but I'll offer an observation. Many of the people and communities, businesses in Bangladesh that installed these solar arrays with battery backup weren't the wealthiest in their country. So actually, the ability to take more and more capabilities and compress them into smaller packages and distribute them all over the place is a huge net benefit in terms of supporting the population at large, in terms of enabling people to achieve things they could never have achieved before. Just to give a simple example, with your mobile handset, your smartphone, it's prosaic to say it, but think of all the things you can do now that you could never have done 20 years ago or even 10 years ago. Think of the transformation we've seen in payments and banking in Africa, for instance, based on not just smartphones, but feature phones with SMS texting, for instance. And by the way, I'm seeing around the world developing countries that are leapfrogging developed nations because they start from a lower base, but then they say, instead of let's copy what the West did and make all their mistakes, instead, they say, what are the newest technologies and what do they allow us to do to solve the problem? So to give you an example, early this year, I took a group from Twin Global, the World Innovation Network, my little cabal of innovators from around the world. And a group of us went to Rwanda. We went to Rwanda, Michael, for two reasons. One, it's 30 years after a genocide,
Right.
the end of the universe. And yet today, Rwanda is the most successful country in Africa. Now, how does that happen? And so I was really excited to go and try and learn and meet some people leading this transformation. And the other reason is that there are extraordinarily interesting things going on there. So I'll give you one very proximity relevant example. A decade ago, the government said, you know what, we need to figure out how to get medical supplies and blood all around the country. Now, the traditional response would be, well, you don't have good infrastructure, so let's get billions of dollars from the World Bank, build roads. It'll take a decade or more, and finally you'll have the ability to drive this stuff. And they said, well, that's ridiculous. Let's use drones. And so guess what they do today with Zipline? They can get medical supplies and blood anywhere in the country within a matter of hours using drones. Drones are one of dozens of different technologies driving proximity. So they leapfrogged us. In Bhutan, I mentioned that before, they've set up small scale hydroelectric plants. And when I say small scale, many of these are the size of a barn or a shed. And these are distributed increasingly around the country, producing electricity closer to where it's actually demanded. And so many developing countries are leapfrogging us. Meanwhile, Singapore recently, the last few years, made an objective. They said by 2030, we need 30% of all of our nutrition grown in country. Now think about that. Singapore is a city-state. They have no land. And yet they said, we're going to figure out how to produce, not just have warehouses, but produce 30% of our nutrition right here in Singapore. I believe it was Jeff Bezos recently gave a large donation to the National University of Singapore to support alternative proteins and things like cultured meats, et cetera, to allow Singapore to figure that out. And when Singapore figures out how to do that, think about where that could go all around the world.
And I was a portfolio manager at Soros some time ago, and one of George's concepts or premises was infallibility, and that he's not infallible. And so, if you were wrong on all this, how or what would be wrong, or how could it change, or why would it change?
No. That's a fabulous question. But first of all, the last decade, and I hope we make this case effectively in the book. We're not wrong, because we can show over the past decade that this has been progressively happening across industries. It looks different in different industries, but it's been happening now for at least a decade and is likely to continue. But one of the things we did, being true to Soros's premise, is early on we said, what are some spaces where this is not going to happen for a really long time? And we tried to come up with counter examples. One of those spaces that I thought was, boy, it's going to take a really long time for this to be possible proximate, was pharmaceutical drug production. And so I went out and looked around and discovered that it's already possible. It's already happening. So there's a company called On Demand Pharmaceuticals. It came out of a big grant from DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. The equipment is the size of a big refrigerator, and it sits there with carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Basically, they're APIs if you like pharmaceuticals, but set that aside. It sits there with carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen doing nothing until the doctor types in, I need 1,000 doses of atropine, or I need 300 doses of ciprofloxacin, whatever it is. And hours later, out come 300 doses of ciprofloxacin, exactly the same as you would get at the pharmacy. Now, this has already been confirmed by the FDA. The output of this equipment is exactly the same as you get at the pharmacy, and they have their first commercial implementation. It's already being used a bit by the military. They have their first commercial implementation in Tupelo, Mississippi, in a very underserved community. And from the moment they turned this equipment on in January to today, they've had 0 stockouts for 6 injectable drugs they chose for this trial. And that's the first time in their history. So this stuff is becoming possible for really almost anything. I could also share an example from Africa, where an African company, BioUsawa, is now making monoclonal antibodies. They drop in 2 containers size containers with the equipment and the technology to make monoclonal antibodies. And within less than a year, they're producing the product right there in Rwanda. And they're planning to open a facility in Ghana, and then they'll open a facility in other countries in Africa. This was founded by a friend of mine, Dr. Menges Bairu, who's from Eritrea. He had a great career in the United States in pharma and biotech, and he said, Africa makes no monoclonal antibodies. We need to solve that. And they're doing it. So by the year 2030, they project we'll be making all the monoclonal antibodies necessary in Africa right here on continent. And so this stuff is, even in a counterexample like that, we found a potent case where it's already happening.
So what doesn't it work for?
Well, eventually, I mean, I know this sounds crazy, but you know what? Read the conclusion of the book. We get a little bit crazy there. If you play the movie out 50, 100 years, there's really nothing that it can't apply to and eventually apply to in a competitive way. But let me add a nuance here. What we're not saying is that everything will be produced and provided at the moment of demand. What we're saying is value produced and provided. What do I mean by this? Before COVID, I was having a conversation about proximity with a friend in the luxury goods industry. And she said, well, you know, that's really neat, but you know what, Rob, we have customers that pay, you know, $10,000 for a handbag because it was produced by nuns in the Dolomites. And there's something about having to wait 6 months for your luxury handbag that is a value. And I said, okay, well, that's an interesting example because here's the thing. The value the consumer's getting is the story. The value the consumer's getting is the fact that they have to wait 6 months for a bunch of nuns to make a handbag. That's the value. It's not the handbag. So that doesn't violate this premise of proximity at all. What we're proposing is the value, whatever that is, not the product, service, or experience, but the value that people get from it will increasingly be able to be produced and provided ever closer to the moment of demand. And that's what's different from the past.
So, so luxury goods continue to be. So you could conceivably make luxury goods, but it doesn't. If people still care about the story, then it doesn't.
Yeah, it depends on the value proposition. You could also hypothesize, and there are examples where having entirely customized, in the moment, responsive products at high quality available wherever a consumer wants it, where that would actually be the value proposition. And that will work quite well in the luxury goods space because you'll be able to provide highly customized things that no one has been able to provide before. And you'll be able to do it fast. And they have high margins to work with. So it's not about where and when you produce the product, service, or experience. Ultimately, it's about the value that customers desire. And so digital technologies of all sorts change what's possible. And the more you can get to the root of what and why consumers, customers are buying or paying for your product, service, or experience, the more you can then re-envision how it might be possible in the future. And by the way, in the book, we have an appendix, which is the proximity strategy workbook. So you can take that workbook and look at your own industry, your own customers and offerings, and say, how might proximity allow us to become far more competitive, not just in the long run, but in the nearer term?
Shifting gears from your book to other books, any book you've read recently that's good that you recommend? Could be about anything.
Oh, wow. Well, that's a big question, Michael. And I have to admit, my favorite subject, bar none, is history. And I recently started reading a couple of reprints of books of American history published in the 20s and 30s that won the Pulitzer Prize. And one is called The Founding of New England. And I don't know how many of your listeners would be interested in that, but I have learned so much about Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Maine, New Hampshire, this little enclave of the world and its place within the British Empire. So I've just been super excited to see this perspective from the 20s and 30s that was widely lauded at the time, but I think we've lost track of.
I'll tell you a funny coincidence. I saw the Bernard Shaw play on Sunday called "The Devil's Disciple" about the American Revolution. So there may be others out there who are interested.
Oh,
What
fantastic.
advice? Sorry, what were you saying?
No, I said that's fantastic. I haven't seen that. I'll keep my eye open for it.
Yeah, it's in New York City. It's off of Broadway, but it's very good. Anyway, any advice you have for fellow investors in light of this, what will likely be an increasingly disrupted world?
Sure. As you know, Michael, I certainly love public markets. And by the way, I shouldn't say this, but I don't care much about sports, honestly, except the business of sports. But I consider the public markets sort of like sports, and Barron's is like my sports page. So I love that. But I also am very active as a venture investor. So I look at a lot of early stage, Series B, Series C, mid stage sort of companies. And one pivotal question I'm always asking is, are they leading the proximity revolution? And if they are, I'm going to consider it. And if they're not, I'm going to wonder why. I'm going to say, why are you recreating the 20th century here? So, I mean, we could give tons of examples. I gave you the example of Axon, the example of Nano Dimension, both publicly traded. Another one that keeps popping up is SoFi. So many analysts have started as social finance, student loans, but that's a small part of what they do now. So many analysts really haven't understood this company, and so they'll do their quarterly. They'll blow away the numbers. The stock will pop, and then it'll shift. It'll list back down again, and then it'll pop again and list back down again, because people haven't figured out that you don't value SoFi the same way as you value Bank of America. And SoFi is bringing proximity to a new generation of consumers, investors, people who want to build wealth.
Great. Well, on that note, I think we're about out of time. We'd like to thank you for, the super interesting discussion and sharing your most valuable asset with us, your time. We hope listeners have a better appreciation for what one of our more thoughtful and innovative professors, authors, and investors is thinking about, and how we may all benefit from it as allocators or investors. This is your host, Michael Oliver Weinberg, hoping you join us again for our next episode, where we speak with another thought leader who will provide insight into improving alpha via innovation. Thank you, Rob.
Thanks so much, Michael. If anybody wants to reach me, I'm always on LinkedIn.
Same here. Have a great one. Bye.
Thank you for joining us on the Improving Alpha, Innovation in Investing, ESG and Technology podcast, presented in partnership with Vidrio Financial and sponsored by Alternatives Watch and PEVC Tech. Vidrio Financial offers a cutting-edge data management solution that not only collects and cleans your data, but also empowers investment teams to cut through the noise and extract valuable insights for better decision-making in areas such as valuation, risk assessment, and portfolio management. If you're an endowment, foundation, pension, sovereign wealth fund, asset manager, OCIO, or family office facing challenges with your data pipelines, we invite you to connect with us today and explore how Vidrio can seamlessly integrate with your investment team to enhance your data management capabilities. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the guests and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of Vidrio Financial or our host, Michael Oliver Weinberg. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional investing advice. Always seek the advice of your financial advisor or other qualified financial service provider with any questions you may have regarding investment planning.